It was a still autumn evening in rural Oxfordshire on November 3rd, 1888. Farmers had settled their flocks for the night, penning the sheep safely behind fences as usual. The countryside was quiet and uneventful. But shortly after 8 o'clock, that peace was shattered in a night of sheep-induced terror, an event that later writers would dub the Great Sheep Panic of '88. Between 8 and 9 that night, an unprecedented panic swept through flocks across roughly 200 square miles of English countryside. Sheep that had been calm just minutes earlier suddenly bolted as if some invisible terror had descended upon them. They smashed through fences and hurtled over pens, entire herds galloping off in every direction across fields and through hedges. The hill country north of the River Thames was especially hard hit, with shepherds later recalling that all their flocks seemed to go wild simultaneously. Villagers called out to one another in the darkness, trying in vain to understand what was happening as the sounds of havoc carried through the night. People stood in their doorways listening to the bewildering din of bleating and trampling, unable to see anything in the black fields. By the time the chaos finally subsided, the orderly calm of rural life had been upended. When daylight broke on November 4th, the full scale of the event became clear. That night, the normally polite sheep had seen their behavior take what I can only dub a U-turn. I'll let that one sink in for a second. Where there should have been neat flocks grazing on dewy grass, farmers instead found empty pastures and broken hurdles. Eventually the missing sheep were discovered, scattered far from home. Many animals were found huddled under hedges or pressed into corners of fields, panting with fear. It was as if a nightmare had swept over the countryside, leaving the flocks shaken and disoriented, but thankfully largely unharmed physically. As farmers compared notes that morning, it became clear that virtually every large flock in the district had been affected. From one end of Oxfordshire to the other, few if any farms escaped the panic. The idea that tens of thousands of sheep in dozens of villages could all be terror-stricken at the same moment defied belief, and even veteran shepherds couldn't explain it. In the immediate aftermath, people grasped for an explanation. The first suspects in any livestock stampede are typically predators or pranksters. Could a pack of dogs or wild foxes have roamed the countryside that night, harassing sheep from farm to farm? It seemed highly unlikely given the scale of the sheep panic. Further, there were no telltale injuries or bite marks on the sheep that might suggest predators either. Human mischief was also considered and quickly dismissed. It would have taken an army of troublemakers working in perfect unison to frighten and release so many animals at once, something clearly impossible. With wolves, vandals, and human mishaps ruled out, attention turned to natural phenomena. Some pointed out that the night had been unusually dark, with occasional flickers of distant lightning. There was no raging storm overhead, only a bit of lightning on the horizon, something sheep often experience without incident. An exotic electrical disturbance in the atmosphere, for instance ball lightning, was suggested, but there was no clear sign of anything so dramatic in the sky that night. Others wondered if a tremor in the earth might have been the culprit. Animals are known to panic before earthquakes, sensing vibrations that people miss. Perhaps a slight earthquake ripple passed under the fields, startling the sheep in a way that was somehow not felt by any other humans or animals. However, no one in the region felt any quake, and observatories recorded nothing unusual on that day, though these were rudimentary by our standards. Similarly, some proposed that a meteor might have exploded high above, producing a sonic boom or flash that frightened the animals. But once again, nothing extraordinary was seen or heard in the sky that evening. Lacking any obvious external trigger, Some experts suggested the cause might lie in the sheep's own herd instincts. One frightened flock can set off dozens more. If even a couple of groups of sheep had entered panic mode for any reason, their frantic bleating and movement might have carried through the still night air and alarmed other flocks. The sheep could have essentially fallen like dominoes across the countryside. In the end, no definitive cause was ever confirmed for the Great Sheep Panic of 1888, and it remains perhaps the greatest sheep-related mystery of all time. Deep in the remote sands of the Gobi Desert, a terrifying legend has taken shape. Mongolian herders whisper of a deadly creature lurking beneath the dunes, a worm-like monster known locally as the Olgoi Khorkhoi, or large intestine worm. In Western lore, it's called the Mongolian death worm, an alleged beast said to kill with a mere touch, or even at a distance. According to traditional accounts, this blood-red, sausage-shaped creature can spit corrosive venom, and even deliver lethal electric shocks to its victims. Tales of the Olgoi Khorkhoi have circulated in Mongolia for generations, long before outsiders heard of it. The very name paints a visceral image. Locals liken it to a cow's intestine, vividly conveying its reported shape and coloration. Early 20th century expeditions in Mongolia brought the first Western documentation of this legend. In 1919, American explorer Roy Chapman Andrews, often styled as a quote-unquote real-life Indiana Jones, met with Mongolian officials who startled him with an unusual request. They asked if he could capture a live specimen of this elusive creature and bring it back to them for further examination. Andrews, being an Indiana Jones type, of course agreed to this, but was unable to ever locate a real Olgoi Khorkhoi. Andrews noted that none of them had seen the animal themselves, but all were convinced it was a legitimate beast. Notably, even the well-educated Mongolian Prime Minister recounted stories of the supposed animal to him, indicating that this wasn't simply a backcountry superstition. These meetings, and the quest for the creature, were recounted in Andrews' 1926 book, On the Trail of Ancient Man, which introduced the West to the Mongolian death worm legend. Through the 1920s and 1930s, Soviet researchers in the Gobi also collected local tales. And for a little bit of historical context, at the time, Mongolia had fallen fully into the Soviet sphere of influence. Explorers A.D. Simakov and Ivan Yefremov heard many stories of the Olgoi Khorkhoi, consistently depicting a lethal sausage-like worm that lived underground and surfaced after rains. If a person spotted the creature, the only advice was to flee. These early reports agreed on the core image of the death worm, a burrowing, legless nightmare. But beyond that, details varied wildly. Some Mongolian storytellers swore the worm was barely a foot long, while others insisted it could grow as large as a man. It was described as red or brown, sometimes with indistinct features at its ends, leading some to say it had spikes, or that you couldn't tell head from tail. Some stories of the creature included more obvious fantastical elements, like suggesting that it could fly away if it was prevented from burrowing. During Mongolia's communist era in the mid-20th century, talk of the death worm was reportedly discouraged or outright banned, reinforcing an air of mystery around it. Despite the silence, the legend lived on in nomadic oral tradition, awaiting a time when curious outsiders would pick up its trail. By the late 20th century, the Mongolian death worm had captured the imagination of adventurers and scientists alike. In 1983, a Soviet research team led by Yuri Gorilov, a conservationist working in the Gobi, stumbled upon a clue that could explain the legend. They heard rumors that an old herder had actually captured a live Olgoi Khorkhoi near a remote oasis. Rushing to the scene, Gorilov saw movement in a hole and reached in barehanded, defying local warnings. What he pulled out was a fat, blunt-headed snake known as a Tartar sand boa. To Gorlov's surprise, every local Mongolian present identified the snake as the death worm itself. The Tartar sand boa is a non-venomous burrowing snake about 2 to 3 feet long, with a thick body that could resemble a worm or legless lizard to the untrained eye. This discovery suggested that the terrifying worm might not be a worm at all, but rather a case of mistaken identity. Soviet scientists noted that the sand boa's appearance fit many descriptions: a stout cylindrical creature that lurks under sand and occasionally surfaces, especially in wetter conditions. However, its very mundane nature stood in stark contrast to the deadly powers attributed to the Olgoi Khorkhoi. Still, not everyone was convinced by the sand boa explanation. No snake or legless lizard was known to spit acid or emit electric shocks, as the death worm allegedly did. To believers, Gorlov's find explained only a fraction of the lore. They pointed out that tales of the Olgoi Khorkhoi predated scientific awareness of the sand boa, and that Mongolian nomads surely knew a snake when they saw one. Personally, I find that last part hard to believe, since they definitely thought that the creature they showed Gorlov was a real Mongolian death worm. The first concerted effort to hunt the Mongolian death worm came in the 1990s, just as Mongolia opened its borders after decades of isolation. In 1990, Czech adventurer Ivan Makerley led a small team into the deepest reaches of the Gobi, determined to find the truth behind the legend. Makerley, an engineer-turned-adventurer with a passion for unexplained mysteries, was inspired by Frank Herbert's famous sci-fi novel Dune. Taking a cue from the fictional sandworms of Dune and drawing upon his engineering background, his team built a motorized device. This machine pounded the ground rhythmically in hopes of drawing the subterranean beast to the surface. They roared across desert dunes in a Soviet-made off-road vehicle for 2 months, interviewing nomads and scanning the sands for any sign of the elusive worm. Locals couldn't even advise what bait to use as no one knew the creature's diet, so the team naturally resorted to creative tactics, like using explosives to try to scare the creature to the surface when their makeshift machine didn't work. Makerley's 1990 expedition, though it didn't catch a monster, made a strong impression and raised the profile of this beast tremendously. Undeterred, Makerley returned to Mongolia in 1992 for a second search, this time consulting local shamans for guidance and going fully down the Olgoi Khorkhoi hole. One shaman issued an ominous caution. The Olgoi Khorkhoi was no mere animal, he said, but a malevolent spirit of the desert. Interpreting what this shaman said, I think we may be able to infer that he meant something along the lines of, "Bro, it's definitely not real, but good luck." In 2004, Ivan Makerley embarked on a third and final mission to the Gobi. This time he took to the skies in an ultralight aircraft, surveying the vast desert from above for any anomalous movement or tracks. From the air, the Gobi's expanse only reinforced how improbable it would be to find a single worm-like animal, if it even existed at all. Like the expeditions before, no hard evidence emerged. Makerley, who had spent a good portion of his life chasing the death worm and other mysteries, admitted later in a 2007 interview that he had grown more skeptical about the creature. To date, every attempt to find this creature has turned up empty-handed. However, some still speculate that the Mongolian death worm may be an animal that has yet to be documented by science. While it's universally accepted that the creature has had several layers of legend overlaid upon it, the fact that there may be a kernel of truth keeps adventurers searching. Nestled in the Tver region of western Russia lies Lake Brosno, a lake as rich in local lore as it is in water. Also, I have no idea what I was thinking when I wrote that line, and I thought about rewriting it as I was recording it, but it's too silly not to leave in. For centuries, tales have circulated about a formidable creature inhabiting its depths, a beast known as the Brosno dragon, or Brosnya in Russian. Described as a dragon-like entity, this cryptid has been the subject of numerous legends and eyewitness accounts, some dating back to the 13th century. One of the earliest and most notable legends tells of an encounter between the Brosno dragon and the Tatar-Mongol army in the 13th century. As the story goes, Batu Khan's forces paused at Lake Brosno to rest and allow their horses to drink. Suddenly, a massive creature emerged from the water, roaring fiercely and devouring both horses and soldiers. Terrified, the army retreated, and the city of Novgorod was spared from invasion. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, reports persisted of a giant creature surfacing in the evenings, only to submerge when approached. During World War II, locals even claimed that the beast swallowed a German airplane whole. Eyewitnesses have consistently described Brosnya as a serpentine figure, approximately 16 to 20 feet in length, with a fish-like or snake-like head and large eyes. Some accounts add that the creature possesses an enormous tail and iridescent scales, with a few even suggesting it emits a bioluminescent glow. In 1996, a group of tourists from Moscow reported seeing a dragon-like creature in the lake. Their 7-year-old son was the first to spot it, leading to an apparent photograph of the creature. And I say apparent photograph because despite sources mentioning that such a photograph exists, none of these sources actually include the picture itself. The following year, a news magazine organized an expedition to Lake Brosno to further investigate the creature. Participants included journalists and local officials who aimed to uncover the truth behind the legends. While they didn't encounter the creature firsthand, their investigations revealed that the lake's depth ranged between 120 to 160 feet. This was a new finding and revealed that the lake was much deeper than previously thought. This considerable depth, combined with the lake's ancient origins, led some to speculate that such a habitat could indeed harbor unknown phenomena. Skeptics have proposed various explanations for the Brosno dragon sightings. Some suggest that the creature might be a giant pike or a deformed beaver. And yes, you heard me right on that last part. Their suggestion is basically a giant mutant beaver, which seems like a hypothesis nearly as questionable as it being a dragon. Others hypothesize that natural phenomena could be responsible. For instance, hydrogen sulfide emissions from the lake's bottom might cause water to bubble, creating illusions reminiscent of a dragon's head. Alternatively, the presence of an underwater volcano could produce disturbances on the lake's surface, leading observers to interpret these as signs of a monstrous inhabitant. Wojtek, a Syrian brown bear, became an unlikely yet celebrated member of the Polish Second Corps during World War II. His journey from an orphan cub in Iran to a war hero is a testament to the extraordinary bonds formed in the most unexpected circumstances. In April 1942, Polish soldiers stationed in Iran encountered a young shepherd boy near Hamadan who had found a bear cub. The cub's mother had likely been slain by hunters. Moved by the cub's plight, the soldiers traded for him, offering items like canned beef and chocolate. They named him Wojtek, a traditional Polish name that translates to Happy Warrior. Wojtek quickly became an integral part of the unit, learning to respond to Polish commands rather than his native Arabic. Initially fed condensed milk from an empty vodka bottle, he later developed tastes for fruits, honey, and marmalade. Interestingly, he also acquired a liking for beer, which he often shared with his comrades. Reportedly, Wojtek would even indulge in smoking and enjoyed wrestling with the soldiers, showcasing his playful nature. As the unit prepared to move from the Middle East to Italy to join the British 8th Army, they faced a logistical challenge. British transport regulations prohibited animals on troop ships. To circumvent this, Wojtek was officially enlisted as a private in the Polish army complete with a service number and paybook. This enlistment allowed him to accompany his unit legally, since he was officially a soldier on par with his human comrades. During the grueling Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944, Wojtek's strength proved invaluable. He reportedly carried heavy crates of artillery shells, each weighing approximately 100 pounds, to aid in the resupply efforts. Witnesses noted that he never dropped a single crate, mirroring the actions of his fellow soldiers. In recognition of his contributions, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company adopted an emblem depicting a bear carrying an artillery shell. And personally, I think you may want to take a look at your screen right now if you're just listening, because damn, this emblem is aesthetic. After the war, the Polish Second Corps was demobilized, and Wojtek, along with his comrades, found temporary residence in Berwickshire, Scotland. He became a local celebrity, often visited by journalists and former soldiers. In 1947, Wojtek was transferred to Edinburgh Zoo, where he lived until his death in 1963. Former Polish soldiers would visit, bringing him gifts of food, tobacco, and beer, the bare necessities for Wojtek. While Wojtek's tale is heartwarming, it's natural to question the veracity of such an extraordinary story. Some historians have questioned whether the story was concocted as feel-good wartime propaganda. However, multiple credible sources corroborate the key events of his life. Numerous Polish sources corroborate Wojtek's involvement from their time in the Middle East. The British soldier's account of seeing a bear carrying crates of ammunition lends credence to the narrative. At dusk, a single ripple on Arkansas's White River can spark a legend. For over a century, locals have whispered that something huge lurks beneath its muddy waters, a hulking gray beast, the so-called White River Monster. Rumors of a strange creature in the White River date back at least to the turn of the 20th century. An Arkansas newspaper in 1912 reported that lumbermen saw a massive, boulder-like thing at the bottom of the river which suddenly moved, convincing them it was a giant turtle. Over the next decade, a few other witnesses claimed to see an animal with gray, crusty skin blowing water into the air. These local tales remained obscure until the summer of 1937, when the monster exploded into national news. In July 1937, near Newport, Arkansas, farmer Bramlett Bateman rushed to the White River after his farmhands alerted him that something enormous had risen from the water. Bateman later described the creature as wide as a car and 3 cars long, with a smooth, wrinkled hide like that of an elephant. He wasn't alone. At least 3 other locals attested to the same sight. As word spread, the elusive beast earned the nickname Whitey. Newport soon caught monster fever, and the town quickly built a viewing platform on the riverbank and charged 25 cents admission to crowds of sightseers. Reporters and thrill-seekers poured in, giving the town a much-needed influx of cash during the Depression. The White River Monster became a media sensation. A scuba diver was even hired to search the deep pool where Whitey was seen, but after several dives into the murky water, he came up empty-handed. Some experts suggested at the time the creature was nothing more than an oversized fish, perhaps an alligator gar or giant catfish, or even a floating log stirred by bubbles. By late July, with no definitive proof, the frenzy died down. The mysterious creature slipped out of the headlines, leaving behind only stories and a newfound local legend. The White River Monster stayed quiet, or at least out of the news, for the next few decades, but it simmered below the surface, growing into an Arkansas urban legend. It surfaced again in the early 1970s. In 1971, fresh reports from Newport reignited interest. Several locals claimed they saw a gray, humped creature in the river that summer. One man even snapped a blurry photo of a spiny-backed hump in the water. and soon afterward, enormous three-toed footprints were found pressed in the river mud. Also, while I do have the photograph taken at the time on the screen right now, this is one where I really can't recommend that you take a look if you aren't already doing so. There does appear to be something there that could technically be described as humps, but the photograph is simply too blurry to be useful at all. I suppose that's par for the course for cryptid photography, though. At any rate, despite the grainy nature of the photo, excitement swept the area once more. In 1973, Arkansas's legislature declared part of the White River a White River Monster Refuge, legally protecting the creature within that stretch. By 1974, the sightings had stopped as abruptly as they began, and the monster once again slipped back into obscurity. Dozens of theories have bubbled up over the years. One popular biological theory holds that the monster was actually a known animal misidentified in an unfamiliar environment. For instance, some researchers point to the Florida manatee as a likely candidate. Manatees are massive, often 10 to 15 feet long, weighing over 1,000 pounds, and have smooth gray or nearly white skin. They also make loud blowing sounds when coming up for air, just like witnesses reported of the monsters. Notably, manatees can tolerate fresh water and sometimes wander far from Florida. There's historical precedent for this too, and one even swam to Memphis in 2006 before sadly perishing. A lost manatee in Arkansas could explain a lot. The creature's size, color, and tendency to surface and roll in the water would absolutely fit this cryptid. Many locals also favor the idea of an enormous alligator snapping turtle, a native river creature with a spiky shell and hefty body that could resemble a monster. Even so, the largest snapping turtles on record are still far smaller than a car-sized beast described in the White River Monster urban legend. Of course, there's always the chance that the White River Monster was more imagination than reality, a mix of exaggerated sightings and hoaxes. The 1937 monster craze gave Newport a welcome boost during times of economic hardship, so some believe the hype was deliberately encouraged for publicity. This may have explained the genesis of the urban legend, and from there people began to believe they really saw this fantastical creature. To this day, the White River Monster remains an unsolved mystery. What's certain is that the monster has left a lasting mark on Arkansas lore. Interestingly, some people have also added to the lore by claiming early American settlers or Native Americans interacted with the creature. These, however, appear to be definite later fabrications to give the story more of an air of reality. Interestingly, Newport and the surrounding region still embrace the legend with local festivals, museum exhibits, and an official refuge along the river. If the White River Monster was a hoax drummed up during the Depression to boost the economy, it's still paying dividends almost a century later.